Hi everybody, I'm Dickson and I want to welcome you back to our final discussion in this first series of structure types. And we decided when we started that there were 17 different types of structure. We're going to talk about them all. But the most common structure was bars. And then as we broke bars down into different categories, there's a three-sided bar, two-sided bar, and one-sided bar. And then we gave some examples of fishing, how to fish these different types of bars. And we concluded that some you could fish very effectively by just casting. Others, you could really only fish it by trolling. And then in most all cases, 9 out of 10 times, we concluded that trolling and casting both should be used to thoroughly cover most all bars of any and all types. But the one we haven't touched on yet is the one-sided bar, and that's the final one in our discussion. That's what we're going to talk about today. And in the original opening of this series, we talked about saucer-type lakes is where you're going to find these one-sided bars. Many of the lakes in Florida, almost every lake in Florida, is a saucer-type lake. On the other extreme, the Great Lakes are glacier lakes that are saucer-type lakes, just different depths. But they're all shaped pretty much the same way. And whether it's the Great Lakes or whether it's here in Florida, these saucer-type lakes, they really don't have conventional types of structure. They don't have three-sided bars. They don't have the two-sided bars, which we talked about the other day. They really only have deep water break lines that are occurring miles and miles from the shoreline in the case of the Great Lakes. Down here in Florida, even if it's 100 yards out or 200 yards out in the middle of the lake, you have these deeper water slots. And at these deep water slots, you have some break lines, and for the bulk of the season, 10 months out of the year, 11 months out of the year, those fish are living in those deep water trenches, deep water holes. And when they become active, they move to the break line, and that's as far as they go. They don't cross over all of these flats leading into the grass and the lily pads and all those places where most other fishermen fish. So keep in mind, when we're talking a saucer-type lake, a one-sided bar, I'm going to explain it the best way I know how to explain it. It's really not a bar, but it's a bar-like feature. The importance is this: when fish move out of the deep water slots or holes, they move into a break line. But these break lines run for long distances, sometimes a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. In the case of Great Lakes, miles and miles and miles and miles. And the fish aren't going to hit the break line and then move towards the bank. They're not going to do it. They hit the break line as far as they go and it drop back down. But the question comes up, where are they going to hit the break line? They're down in the deep water, and the way they see these break lines is they see it as a change in light. Just like a scuba diver will tell you. You can look up at a drop off, you see a change in light. Fish see it very well. But if you have a break line like that that runs for 2 miles, the question is, where along that break line will the fish hit it? And the answer is they're going to hit it at a break on that break line. Something that's different from the rest of that break line. We know it's all breaking into the deep water hole or slot, but it doesn't run straight like a ruler. It's going to be changing direction a little bit, in and out, and in many cases, what happens is you'll be following that break line, all of a sudden it'll turn out towards the deep water and turn back in like that and then continue on down. Well, that creates a bar-like feature. That's the reason we have it in this category that we talk about. It's not really a bar, but it's a bar-like structure condition. And it's also the thing that reaches out the furthest into that deep water hole. It's the first thing the fish see. So this would become a contact point. Now we have something else we have to discuss right here, is these break lines. In many cases in Florida, I'm saying in 80%, maybe even higher, 90% of the cases, these break lines are only maybe a foot in actual change of depth. sometimes only 6 inches. And most people look at me like I'm crazy when I talk about it, but I can't tell you how many times 6-inch break line was the whole key to finding all the fish in a Florida lake. 6 inches. To a fish, that looks like a curb looks like to us, stepping off the sidewalk onto a street. They can see that. It's like a neon sign to them, no problem. But a foot break line, they really see that. But one problem. We got the whole school of fish moving to this bar-like feature on this one-sided bar-like feature, and they move up there in a foot break line. You can't fit 400 fish in that. So what they do in Florida and in saucer-type lakes, they'll scatter along the break line. So when you start thinking in terms of, well, if all that is the case, which it is, what's the best way to fish it? Well, let me explain it like this. Some of those bar-like features that we're talking about, some of them are quite broad and large and subtle. We can see it by just watching the wake of our boat when we're following it. A lot of them are subtle. And they could actually be cast. You could get up on the flat and fan cast the whole thing. But some of them are so large and so subtle, it's not the best way of doing it. You could do it that way. It's not the best way. And there's no way you can parallel cast, get on the edge of the break line parallel cast, because it's not straight. It's going here, there, you know, you can't do it. So what's the best way to fish it? Trolling. You guessed it. Trolling by far. Best way to fish these one-sided features, because they might be making contact right here at this bar-like feature, but I'm catching fish for the next 50 yards that are strung along that break line. Where if I was just sitting casting this one little spot, I wouldn't catch those fish. Or it could be 50 yards this way. It could be both. I could be catching fish for 100 yards that was fed by one contact point. So by trolling, you're not missing anything. And it allows you to keep your lure right on that spot 100% of the time. Trolling, watching your meter, like trolling any other break line. So one-sided bars, very, very important in our fishing. I'll give you a couple examples. The very first time I met Buck Perry. Now, if you don't know that story, you haven't read it, do me a favor, go to my website, dondicksonfishing.com. And it was the first blog I did, I don't know, 3 months ago or so when I started. And I want you to read it. It was an accidental meeting, and he took pity on me, took me out fishing. And it was about 3.5 hours, close as I can remember. At the most, it was 4 hours. He took me out in the middle of the lake, and he started throwing these homemade markers that he had made. I didn't know what a marker was. This is 1970. He had big gallon jugs, like milk jugs. And tied to that, he had railroad spikes. I had no idea. They're laying all over his little boat. And I'm going like, what is that? They were markers. And he started going down there looking at his little depth signer, and started going down. It was a deep water slot. And started throwing markers up on this flat. And he strung those markers out on this 20,000 acre lake for about a mile. Maybe even a little bit further. And you can see those jugs very plain, very clear. And the lake is so big, there's no way in the world you could have seen a regular marker. Just couldn't have seen it. So he knew what he was doing, obviously, by bringing those milk jugs out there. Anyway, he threw them out there, and he explained to me we were going to be trolling. And what it amounted to, we were trolling one-sided bars. And he threw his milk jugs on every one of those little turns, one of those bar-like features, going down there for 1.5 miles or 2 miles, whatever the heck it was, in a lake called Orange Lake, Florida. Big, huge lake, natural lake, saucer lake. I had no idea what he was doing. I thought he was crazy. And in that little bit of time, 3.5, 4 hours, we caught 55 of the biggest bass I'd ever seen in my life. Now, I was a stockbroker back in Pittsburgh. Been hunting and fishing all my life, and in summer months, I catch trout pretty good, but in summer months, catching fish, never happened. I think the biggest bass I ever caught was about 2.5 pounds. And in that one morning with Buck Perry, fishing one-sided bars, without changing lures, not one time, all day long, or all morning long, we caught 55 of the biggest bass I'd ever seen. And that day, I was convinced I was going to learn everything this guy knew about fishing, because I couldn't imagine something like that happening in the real world. I never saw anybody do it, obviously. Certainly wasn't ever part of anything like that, but I never even saw pictures or something like that. It was crazy. He said, this is not the exception. This is the rule. When you're going about your fishing, like we do, and always be aware of these slots, these deep water slots in these saucer lakes, and these one-sided bars. That's where you're going to find your fish. And since that time, I can show you a picture. I'll show you a picture right now. Where 3 years later, I took him fishing in a Florida lake, fishing one-sided bars, and here's the results. I wanted you to see that. So don't forget, one-sided bar, it's like almost an absolute necessity. If you're fishing a saucer type lake, that's where you're going to find your fish, because they don't have conventional type structures. Now, I'll give you one other example, which is really crazy, but I think it makes the point. There's a couple of short examples I can give you. First, Lake Erie, catching smallmouth bass in 47 feet of water on about 3 miles out, on a break line with one-sided bars, catching fish all day long. Caught like 200 bass, all at 47 feet. My Florida lakes, I'm catching them on the same type of structure, one-sided bars, but in about 12 feet. So it spans the United States. When you got a structure situation, the only one that exists is one-sided bar. All you got to do is start trolling, and you're going to find a fish. They're going to be there, and you're always going to find them on an unusual feature. Give you a close with one more quick story. I was hired as a fishing consultant in the state of Illinois back in 1980. One of the things they wanted was to do a lot of clinics and schools, which I did, but they also wanted me to make a film on Lake Michigan. And they had introduced the salmon, the Chinook salmon, and some of the cold water species, the trout species, into Lake Michigan, but on the Illinois side. Of course, over on the Michigan side, they'd been fishing for those fish for years and years and years, but on the Illinois side, they were starting to introduce these fish to the big lake. They wanted me to make a movie, and they wanted to send it around the world as to how you could bring your corporate people over and have your meetings and so on and so forth with all the culture of Chicago, but by noontime you could be out here in this big lake catching 25 to 30 pound salmon. So that's what they wanted. So I said, okay, I'll make film. They paid me way more money than I was worth. And I went out, and they also wanted me to use a charter captain, because they had a big charter boat association. They wanted me to basically advertise their charter boat guys. I said, I'll do that, but I like to do my own fishing. So I talked to a guy who was president of that organization at the time. He was supposed to be the best captain on the lake, and I said, okay, we'll use him. We'll go out, and we went out for a morning. We hadn't caught the first fish. And we're doing something that I don't do every day, of course, but I said to him about noontime, I said, brother, I know this is your lake and so on and so forth. I said, but I don't want to spend 4 or 5 days making this film. I want to make it today. I said, I want to know if you know of any place where there's a break line, where there's a drop-off, a break line. He said, what do you mean? He had no concept of what a break line was. And I couldn't believe that. This is a guy who's a captain on a big boat, you know. So while I'm talking to him for about 2-minute period right there, I saw his depth sign. I was standing up in the cabin, and I've got senators and congressmen in the back of the boat. They're my crew, right? We're going to play up this big deal, and all of a sudden I see it go from 90 feet to 120 feet. And I said, whoa, hold it just a minute. I said, that's what I'm talking about right there. Did you see we went 90 feet? It's 120 feet. I said, turn this boat around. He looked at me like I lost my mind. He said, you can't just turn a boat like this around. You know, he had all these downriggers out and all this stuff, you know. He said, you got to go slow, you know. So he started making this gradual turn, you know, driving me crazy. I said, because of the direction we were heading, I said, head this boat towards the north or the southwest until you see 90 feet. I want to see your depth sign to come to 90 feet, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So he kept making a big deal about it. It takes a long time to get this boat turned, and it did take about 15 or 20 minutes to get straightened out, heading back to the way I wanted to head. I said, now here's what I want you to do. Before we get there, when you see that depth sighter start coming up towards that 90 feet, I want you to swing this boat and start heading northwest. Just use your compass. Start heading northwest, but don't turn it sharp. Just angle the boat. Sure enough, we finally came to it. It started coming up 90 feet, and he started turning the boat. I said, don't turn it, just angle it. Keep it heading northwest. And then I had these sightings that I give them to keep the compass on certain sightings, to keep this thing around this 90 feet. I wanted to fish break line. Now we're fishing for the cold water species. Everybody knows they suspend. They suspend vertically. Unlike a bass, they'll suspend vertically. But they're always suspending on or connected to somehow some break line that's connected. And the fish will suspend above a break line. They'll suspend above breaks. They'll suspend above structure. Never just out in the middle of nowhere. But if these guys are catching fish out on that big lake, they think they're catching the middle of nowhere. They're not. Those fish are related to something. And once he got started making a pass on that 90, turn off, breaking, turn it back in, come up to 90, turn it back off, breaking. We didn't go but about 200 yards, and that depth sighter lit up with fish. We had about 11 Chinook salmon in the boat within about an hour and a half. Our movie was made. One-sided bars. Just following that break line and turning, and the fish were suspended over that break line. So you can go from a shallow lake with 15 feet of water in the deepest spot in Florida to the Great Lakes. And when you don't have conventional structure, that's what you got. One-sided bars. And in all fishing, including the trout, the salmon, the walleyes in Lake Erie, they're relating to something, guys. Normally walleyes don't suspend, but in a Lake Erie situation they do, because they're so far out. They're not going into the shoreline at a migration, they suspend. But it's always above a feature which you and I can see and they can see. And once they're suspended, know this, they're active. When fish are suspended, that means they're active and they're easy to catch. It's finding fish that's the key. And in a saucer type lake, whether it's shallow or deep, one-sided bars are critical. Okay, that pretty much clears up all of the bars. In our next discussion, we're going to be talking about humps. And there's three main types of pure humps, and then there's two other hump-like features or structure situations that we're going to talk about as well. So all told, about 5 different sections we're going to have on humps. And all other things being equal, they're the best structures we have. So like us on Facebook if you would, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And get your friends involved so we can all talk about the same thing, talk together and learn together. And I appreciate you being with me. I'll see you next time.